Hi everyone, Frank Spangler for Learning Media Skills. And in today's lesson, we're going to cover some of the most important principles of getting better photos, even when using the auto settings of your camera. You know, some people say, if only I had a really good camera with a really wonderful lens, then I would be able to take better photographs. And there may be some truth to that. But it is also true that you can give someone a very expensive camera and they'll still come back from a shoot with a card full of bad shots. And the reverse is also true. You can hand someone an entry-level camera, a cheap, inexpensive camera, or even send them out with a smartphone. And if they know just a few key principles of getting good shots, they will come back with some compelling images that would really amaze you. You would hardly believe that they had been out on their shoot with an inexpensive camera or just a phone. You can learn to do the same thing with just a few easy tips that I will share with you in this lesson. Let's get started. Many people ask, what is wrong with my photos? I went out, I saw some great things, I took lots of photos, but none of them turned out. None of them were very interesting. I had to delete most all of them. What went wrong? Well, the first thing that I want to do is assure you that in many cases, it's not completely your fault. It's the fault of the camera. Even the most expensive cameras on the market today are still not as good as our eyes. Our eyes see more. We have these amazing eyes that are much more capable than even the best cameras. Our eyes see more perspective, more depth, more dimension, levels of contrast, levels of exposure, details in the shadows. What we think should be a good photo by looking out from our eyes will often not look very good when taken with a camera. The good news is that once you know that, there are things that you can do to compensate for the deficiencies of the camera by making just a few adjustments to your schedule, to your setting, to your subject, to the lighting and composition. By just making a few adjustments in these areas, it's going to make all the difference in the world. Take a look at this photo. I'm guessing that some of you might recognize this kind of photo because you see a lot of them just like this on your phone. What do you think has happened? Well, most cameras these days have computers inside and light sensors that help the computer make exposure decisions. The computer saw the bright ground behind this shot and automatically set the exposure to correctly expose for the ground, which left the face of the person in dark shadows. Now, there are two things that you could do to compensate for this kind of problem. You could learn how to shoot with the manual settings of your camera, and in some upcoming lessons here at Learning Media Skills, we're going to do that in our continuing series on the 90D, the Canon 90D camera. But today, in this lesson, we're focusing in on how to get better photos just still using only the auto settings. And so if you're not yet ready to switch to the manual settings of your camera, this lesson today is going to be very helpful. So the other thing that you can do without having to learn the manual settings of your camera is just to reposition your subject slightly so that the auto settings of the camera don't get tricked. One easy fix is to simply move your subject into the doorway of their home. A simple principle in photography is this: if your background is darker than the skin color of your subject, the camera will get you a correct exposure on the face. We'll talk more about this in a few minutes. There's another principle that I want to talk about first, and that is composition. People will ask, why are my photographs so boring? I come back from my vacation and I show my shots to my friends, and I can tell that they're just not that interested. It doesn't catch their eye. On my Facebook feed, I see other people displaying beautiful photographs that just draw you in. What can I do to make my shots more compelling or have more impact on the viewer? Well, the first thing that you need to remember about photographs is that they are two-dimensional. They have height, they have width, but no depth. As much as you might like to, you cannot step into this shot and walk on the beach. You can't smell the smells, you can't hear the seagulls screech, and so what may have been a wonderful experience for you is never going to have the same impact on your viewers. The photograph is dull, it's flat, it's two-dimensional. Now, because you were there when you took the photograph, it will always have a greater impact on you than it will your audience. Because the image evokes a memory for you, you are more likely to see in your mind's eye a lot more depth. You might, in your memory, hear the waves on the sand, smell the salt air in your mind. But your viewer is never going to feel that same emotion because they just weren't there. The good news is that there are a few simple things that you can do to give your photographs a sense of depth and pleasing symmetry that will draw your viewer in. Take a look at this photo, taken at Inle Lake in Myanmar. Does it capture your attention? What are some of the elements that we could identify in this photograph that help capture the attention? Well, first of all, there is a sense of depth. There are objects in the foreground that lead your eye into the image with compelling shapes in the background. There are repeating patterns, the rings of the fishing net, the three fishermen. And by the way, groups of three are always effective. There is dramatic lighting. The fishermen are silhouetted by the sun. It's almost monochromatic. It is taken in what I call the golden hour, just before sunset. There are so many elements going on here. Let's maybe go back and start with one of the most basic principles of photography. And many of you may have studied this before or heard about this before, but I know that there's some of you out there that may not be aware of this. After taking photos for a lifetime, this has become so second nature to me that I really do it without thinking, and sometimes I forget that there may be people who have never heard of this before. And that is the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds is where you divide up the viewfinder in your camera into these lines of three, vertical and horizontal. And if possible, even attempt to put the actual point of interest, the most important part of your image, so that it is on one of these points where the lines intersect. In this example, you see that the tree is on an intersecting point. But also note that the horizon is placed on one of these lines where we have 2/3 land and 1/3 sky. This gives the image more balance, more interest, more symmetry. But notice that it can be Also, just as interesting and effective when the horizon falls along the lower third of the image. What most people do is simply center and shoot. Notice this lighthouse at Peggy's Cove, Nova Scotia. The horizon is going right through the center of the shot, and the lighthouse is smack dab in the center of the image. It's okay. It's not bad. The lighting is good, and that helps. I like the blue sky. But notice how much more interesting the shot becomes if you just angle the camera ever so slightly. Now we have 2/3 land and 1/3 sky. And the lighthouse is lined up with the right-hand line of thirds. Now, I should point out that most cameras today have a menu option in your settings. You can turn this on so that you can have these lines of thirds show up on the screen of your camera, and it can help remind you to line up your horizons and your points of interest along these grids that are showing up on your screen. Now, it doesn't affect the photograph itself. It's just to help guide you when you're first learning this principle to line up your images following this rule of thirds. And after you do it for a while, maybe 6 months or so, you can shut that off because you'll just start to do it intuitively without thinking. Check out the menu of your camera. I'm sure most cameras today have an option where you can turn that rule of thirds grid on so to help you get started with this principle. Now let's take a look at this shot. How could we improve this shot? Well, by just moving our camera slightly, we can recompose the shot to make it more interesting. Now people will ask, does it matter which line of thirds that I put the subject or point of interest on when I'm framing up my shot? Can I put her or the subject on the left-hand line of thirds just as easy or as well as it would look if I put her on the right-hand line of thirds? Well, when I'm framing up a shot, I tend to look at two things. First of all, what else is going on in the shot? What else is of interest? Is the activity or the scenery or the background more interesting on the right-hand side, or is it more interesting on the left-hand side? And that will help me decide which line to put the subject on. If there's absolutely nothing of interest on the left-hand side, but something kind of intriguing happening over on the right, well, then I'm going to put the subject on the left so that we can also see a little bit about the person's interest or their activities over on her right. Once I determine that, if I need to, I might move slightly to the left or the right and line up the subject properly. Sometimes I might even have the subject turn their head slightly to follow me, and that sets it up perfectly for positioning them on the right line of thirds or the left line of thirds. Let's take a look at this image, for example. The photographer here followed the rule of thirds in this shot. However, notice all of the empty, uninteresting space on the left. Thankfully, the photographer noticed this and took a second shot and repositioned the camera slightly, and now all of the empty space is filled up with something more interesting. The second thing that I look for when I'm deciding which line of thirds I should put the subject on is by noticing how the subject is naturally positioned. I don't do a lot of portrait photography where I have maybe even an assistant setting people up and positioning them just so. And so I need to take a look at how they are standing naturally and using that make my decision as to which side I'm going to put them on. Notice in this example, the girl's body is turned slightly so that her body is angled to the left. In that case, the photo is going to look more balanced if the subject is lined up on the left side of the photograph. This lady's shoulders are angled to her right, so the photograph will look more pleasingly composed if she is lined up on the right line of thirds. Now, remember that we said that we liked it when the most interesting feature of the photograph falls on one of these intersecting lines. And when you think about it, what is the most important or most interesting feature of people? That's right, it's the eyes. Here, even though the head is looking almost directly at the camera, notice the position of her shoulders. They are angled to her right. And so it is going to look much more natural if she is lined up on the right. Here is an extreme example. Here, the girl is turned away from the camera. We are capturing from the side. In this case, we line her up on the right line of thirds rather than on the center or the left, and this gives her lots of room to look into. And that's important. The same principle holds true if people are walking or running. You want to line them up in such a way that they have lots of room to run into. Shoulders to the left, he is positioned on the left. Again, his eye is very close to the intersection of the lines. Notice the position of the eye is again right along the line of thirds. I even cut off part of the head because I wanted to frame this shot in such a way that the eye was falling right along these intersecting lines. A lot of time I do this without really thinking about it, and then I'll get home and the client will say, "Why are you cutting off all of the heads?" And so it's important to remember to, in addition to following the rule of thirds, to also take a number of shots where you step back or if you have a zoom lens, pull out a little bit so that you do include the complete head, because a lot of photo editors may not like the background that you had when you shot it and want to be able to, in Photoshop, cut out the person and put them on a different background, a different color, so that it goes better with the scheme of the whole ad that they may be working on. And so if you've cut off the head on all of your shots, they don't have the opportunity to be able to swap out the background with something else. So it's important to remember to get a variety of shots. Some that follow the rule of thirds and get that eye in that beautiful intersecting point, but also provide your photo editor with a number of shots that give the full head to work with. And so it's important to take a variety of shots. Take some where the shot is composed properly, following the rule of thirds, so that if need be, you can use your image right away on social media and have it be really compelling. But then, step back, zoom out, get a few more where you are leaving some space for the photo editor to work with. Don't worry if your composition is no longer following the rule of thirds, because in reality, a photo can be easily cropped after the fact to give that same rule of thirds. Later, even though you didn't take it that way, they can frame it up so that it does follow the rule of thirds. But it gives the editor, if they want to use it in a way that has a lot of empty space on one side, to put graphics around your image. A lot of the images that I take might end up in a calendar, where the editor of the calendar wants lots of room on one side to be able to put a message or branding. And so it's important to provide a variety. When you see that you are photographing something that has the potential to become maybe a magazine cover, well, after you have taken some that follow the rule of thirds, by all means, step back, angle your camera over a little bit, and break the rule of thirds and give the photo editor some room to put those all-important graphics about the articles that are going to appear in the magazine itself, or a masthead at the top. You should also take some where the subject is positioned on the right, and then some where the subject is positioned on the left. And that gives your photo editor, again, the option of deciding where to put the graphic. She will love you for it. One more exception to the rule of thirds that I would like to share with you today. After you have gotten a number of shots where that horizon is beautifully lined up on one of those lines of 3, why not take a few shots where it's even more extreme? I call them sky shots, where the land or the horizon is maybe way down on the 15% line, 20% line. This is especially effective if the sky is dramatic. Because these kinds of shots are just a little different, it catches the eye of the viewer. Plus, these kinds of shots can make really nice images to use in PowerPoint presentations, because there is a lot of room for the presenter to put text and graphics. We have a lot more great tips to share on getting better photos, but I wanted to take a moment here to welcome all of our first-time visitors. If you are finding this lesson helpful, I want to invite you to join our family of students and subscribe to our channel. We have a lot more content planned over the next few months, and we would love it if you would come back for some more. You know, there are a lot of great channels out there on photography and video production that have a lot of amazing content. But I believe that our channel is a little different in that we are starting with some of the most basic principles about photography. A lot of those channels out there assume that people are already professionals. I don't know if you've noticed that as you've surfed some of the instructional videos on YouTube. We take you back to the basics. And so if you are just starting out in photography, I believe that you will find this channel very helpful. We will take you step by step with clear instructions that will take you from a complete novice in photography to someone who is getting those amazing shots for your social media, your friends, your YouTube channel, or perhaps your new job responsibility at your office. So, sign up for these free lessons. We're excited to have you join us. Just hit that subscribe button. Okay, enough on the rule of thirds. Let's take a look at another simple thing that you can do to make your photographs have more impact. And that is something as simple as stepping closer. One of the biggest mistakes that people make when they first start taking photographs is that they are just too far away from the people or the action, and the shot just is not very interesting. Now, it is good, I should say, to get some wide shots, what we call establishing shots, so that if you are building a slideshow presentation, you can help people get oriented to the environment that you visited. But once you have those establishing shots, move in closer and get the medium shots. But then, don't stop there. Move in even closer and get the really interesting close-up shots. And spend most of your time on the close-up shots. Here's an outdoor classroom. It is good to get some of these wide angles so that you can let your viewer get an idea of the setting. But don't walk away after you have gotten this shot. Move in for some medium shots, and then spend most of your time getting the close-ups. Even though photographs are two-dimensional, there are some things that you can do to give them a feeling of depth. By having large objects in the foreground of scenic shots, you can add a sense of depth, adding that third dimension feel to a flat photograph. Here is Peggy's Cove again in Nova Scotia, Canada, one of my favorite spots on Earth. You know, a lot of people might look at this scene and just focus in on the little fishing village. And of course, you'll want to get some shots like that. But notice how easy it is to add a sense of depth by including some large rocks in the foreground. It adds that sense of depth to the image. Here, you have so many layers of depth. The tree in the foreground, then the next layer of trees, then the fishing boats on the ocean, the mountains in the background, and then finally the sunset. All of these layers at different points in the photograph give a sense of depth. By framing a shot with some bush or trees in the foreground, you can again add a sense of depth. Here, the rocks help add depth. But there's something else here that adds interest. It is the repeating pattern provided by the reflection. Look for S-curves that start in the foreground and lead the eye of the viewer off into the distance. Rice paddies on a hillside can provide so many opportunities for S-curves. Repeating patterns can add interest, especially when they lead the eye off into the distance, giving a sense of depth. Look for scenes that naturally give a sense of perspective. It might be a road, a train track, a boardwalk, a pier or wharf, but position your camera in such a way that it fills up the shot in the foreground at the bottom of your image, but then gets smaller and smaller into the distance. Another thing that can add a lot of interest to a photograph is to put a natural frame around the subject, especially if that frame has something to do with the person's life. In this case, the girl in Niger is beautifully framed by the window of her new school. What do we mean by leveling up? Well, that is where we want you to make sure that the lens of the camera, for most of your shots, not all, but for most of your shots, are level with the eyes of your subject. And if people are standing, posing for your shot, that's usually not too much problem because they're usually pretty much the same level as you. But if you're taking shots, say, inside a school, where all of the students are sitting at their desk, rather than go into the classroom and just kind of point down at them and get your shots that way, what you should do, rather, is bend your knees so that your camera can be right at the eye level of the student as they sit at their desk. This shot of children at a school in Myanmar would not be nearly as effective if I would have just stood over them and pointed down at them. Sometimes it might be necessary to get right down on your knees to get eye level with your subjects. One of the real advantages of getting down at eye level is that it puts your viewer in eye contact with your subject, which can add a lot of emotional engagement between your viewer and your subject. Now, it's a good idea to always remember to get a good variety of shots. Some where the students may be looking directly into the camera, almost posing. But while you're there, be sure and get some where they're actually doing the activities of being a student in school, writing at their desks. Get some where they are looking at the board or teacher. But remember, almost always you want to be at eye level. However, there are always exceptions to the rules. Sometimes If you can get up even higher and point down at a group of children who are looking up, you might jump up into the bed of a pickup or stand on some platform and be able to look down at the students. That can always be a very interesting, compelling shot. Some dramatic low angles where the camera is pointing up. Even sometimes tilting the camera at an angle can give an interesting feel. The rule is to give a wide variety of shots for your photo editor to choose from. One of the great things about digital cameras is you don't have to worry about how many shots you take. You can always bring lots of cards. Hard drives are cheap, and that is great. One thing about articulating screens, like the one on the back of the 90D that we're doing our lessons on, is that you can position it in such a way where you can shoot over people's heads and still angle the screen and see what you're filming. That's not something that you'll be able to do on some of the older cameras that don't have this articulating screen. You'd have to get up on a stool and be able to look through the viewfinder. Or for those dramatic shots where you're looking up, you can angle the screen so that even though the camera is tilted way down like this, you don't have to get down underneath it to look through the viewfinder to see what you're getting. You can just angle that screen to be able to see your shot. And so that helps out a lot. Now let's come back to lighting. This can be a real problem with shots that are taken when you're completely on the auto setting of the camera. And that's one of the reasons why we hope that you'll stick around. In a few lessons down the road, we're going to teach you how to use some of the other settings on the camera, and then more specifically on how to use complete manual settings on your Canon 90D or any other camera. But when you're still using just the auto settings of the camera, the computer inside the camera can often get tricked and expose for the wrong thing, giving you some really bad shots. Now, the Canon 90D, and in fact most modern cameras today, in addition to the auto settings, have a computer-assisted setting, we'll call it. On the 90D, it's called Scene, or SCN. And when you position your mode to SCN, there is one option there for backlit, and that might help you get a better shot, still using auto settings. We'll talk more about that in a couple lessons down the road. But for now, when you're still on the green, on the 90D, it's green at least, and has an A surrounded by a rectangle there. There are other things that you need to do in order to compensate for bad lighting situations. One easy way to compensate for bad lighting situations is to just simply make a little adjustment to your shooting schedule. A lot of times people, by the time they get out to the park area with their family and start the hike, it might be noon or 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And that is the absolute worst time of day to take photographs. And this comes as a surprise to some people. They have the idea that photography needs lots of light, and during the middle of the day, there's lots of light, and so you'd naturally think that's a good time to take photographs. But you can see what happens here is that the sun is coming from directly above, especially when you're shooting in the tropics around noon. It's hitting the top of the head, which causes the rest of the face to be in dark shadows, especially for people with darker skin color. And this makes it almost impossible to use the photograph because you can barely make out the face. What to do? Well, here are some things. Do your best to make arrangements to be on location at sunrise or shortly after. And if possible, stay until almost sunset. It is early morning and early evening that the light of the sun is best for photography. These are the golden hours. This is when the sun is at an angle and is hitting the face directly and lighting up faces in a very beautiful way. Now, even in golden hours of early morning and late afternoon, you are still going to have to do some positioning in order to get a good shot. You need to have the sun coming over your shoulder and lighting up the face of your subject. But you need to be careful not to position yourself in such a way where your subject has to look directly into the sun, because then you're going to get shots of people squinting into the sun. You might have to move around a little bit to not only get the best light, but have the person comfortable enough with the way the sun is hitting their face to get the best facial expression. And, of course, it always helps if you can get the subject to smile. I want to say a note about cloudy days. Some people get the idea that if it's a cloudy day, well, you might as well not even go out. You might as well just put the camera away. But in fact, a cloudy day can be a great thing for photography, especially shots of people's faces or close-ups of flowers. You can shoot all day on a cloudy day. It doesn't matter if it's noon. You'll still get great shots. You don't have to worry about the harsh light of the middle of the day. The clouds are diffusing all of those harsh shadows for you, giving you nice, even lighting all day long. Don't be concerned that the colors might not be as vibrant on a cloudy day. You can always easily bring out the colors when you work with the image in Photoshop or Lightroom, especially if you are shooting in RAW. But let's say that you find yourself out in the field in the middle of the day on a bright, sunny day. What can you do? Well, the best thing that I have found to do is to bring the subject into their doorway or any doorway, where the background behind them is going to be darker than the subject. Doorways, doorways, doorways are our friends in the middle of the day in the tropics. Take a look at this photograph and see what we can learn. I'm guessing what happened here was that the camera was on auto and exposed for the grass in the foreground where the sun is lighting it up. Here, even though the background was darker than the subject, the camera is still getting tricked. What could we have done here to get a better shot? Well, there are several things that could have been done to improve this shot, even with the camera on the auto settings. One simple solution would have been to ask the subject to come out into the brighter area. The photographer could have moved in closer so that the sensor of the camera did not see the bright areas in the foreground and would more correctly expose for the subject sitting in the shadows. Here is an example of moving the subject into a brighter area in his field, and it helps. But he is still dark on one side of his face. Here is where having an assistant with a reflector could have filled in the right side of his face. You can pick these up at any camera store. They're not that expensive. And it can save so many photographs. The reflector can be used to either bounce light into the face to kind of fill in the dark shadows, or to block light to put the whole face into the same even lighting. Some reflector kits even come with a diffuser, which can be very handy to block harsh sunlight. One of these days we'll have to do a whole lesson on all of the things that you can do with a reflector or a diffuser. It can be a real lifesaver. I have been in many situations where pulling out the reflector has saved the day. If you don't have an assistant with a reflector, you could try turning on your camera flash. The 90D has a little button on the side there. You can pop up a little flash that can fill in some of the dark darker areas of face. And this comes as a surprise to people just starting out in photography. They might think, why would you ever use a flash in the middle of the day? But it can help to fill in some of the dark areas. It's something that you can at least try. Generally, we say the flash on the camera should never be used, especially at night, because it just causes such a harsh lighting that it's a photograph that can hardly be used in a professional way. But out on a sunny day, when you need to take care of some of those shadows, it can be very helpful. Don't forget to use difficult lighting to add drama to your shot. Sunset shots can be a lot more than just sunset shots. By putting things of interest into your foreground, it can add intrigue and catch the viewer's attention. People want to know more. It's perfectly okay that in many cases the subjects are completely silhouetted by the backlighting of the setting sun. It can be very emotive and effective. Look for photos of interest. When you're out there, look for shots where the photo in and of itself tells a story. Photos that hardly need a caption. These kinds of shots usually include some type of activity or treasured icon. It could be how proud a woman is of her new vegetable garden. It could be how happy a girl in Africa is for the chance to go to school. We talked about how important it is to have your photos make eye contact, but it's also important to have some show the subject engaged in their daily activity. It might mean that you take the subject into a setting that describes their passion and interests. The desk, the books, the smile tell the whole story. You'll notice that in this shot, neither the child or the facilitator is looking at the camera, but it is still very interesting because it shows the activity of the health worker teaching the child how to correctly wash their hands. Now, I should point out that these shots were taken before COVID-19, and that is why they are so close to each other and not wearing masks. I like to get shots of people standing by their homes to give people who haven't traveled a window into the lives of people living abroad. Again, I want to emphasize how good it is to get a wide establishing shot, and then move in for some medium shots, and then get the close-ups. Sometimes you need to be bold. After getting this shot, you might be satisfied that you got an interesting shot of a woman sitting by her fire. But why not take a moment and get in a little closer? And when you think that you have gotten close enough, go in even closer for those really great shots. Look for shots that capture emotion. While it is nice to have photos of mother and baby looking at the camera, it can sometimes evoke even more emotion if mother is looking at the baby. You know, those Madonna shots. You can almost sense how much the mother loves her new baby. When I look at this photograph, I see a woman who looks like she is going through a difficult time. I'm drawn in. I want to know more about her story. I want to know what she is facing. This is actually another example of where not all of your shots need to be posed with the subject looking directly into the camera. Sometimes it can be very effective for the subject to be looking off camera or looking away from the camera. It can depict an emotion of sadness and distress. This young woman in Somalia had just lost 2 of her children to a drought that was raging through her land. She is now clinging to the only child she has left. She desperately wanted me to tell her story to the world, and so she invited me into her refugee shelter, and we had an opportunity to interview her and have her tell us her experience that she had gone through. And then what we needed to do was capture the emotion of that story in a photograph. Well, those are the tips that I wanted to share with you in this lesson on some of the basic principles of getting good photos. In our next lesson, we're going to come back to the 90D camera. We're going to spend some time on some of the most basic buttons and wheels and dials that are on this camera, and then spend some time on how to get photos using just the auto settings of the camera. So we hope that you'll come back and join us for that. So long for now.